you. A very good afternoon to all. Now we have Dr. Mekhala Krishnamurthy. She is a senior fellow at CPR and associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University. Over the last 15 years, her research, publications, policy, and professional engagements have involved work within and across a range of field sites and subjects, including so I'll start with areas which are not agriculture: women's courts, dispute resolution, community health workers, public health system, agriculture, markets, land, water, and livelihood security. This has placed her in a variety of roles at the intersection of and in partnership between academia, public policy, government, private sector, grassroots civil society organizations. Her long-standing area of research interest and commitment, which she is currently pursuing in a number of field-based and writing projects, involve understanding the institutional dynamics and everyday life of the state, market, economy in contemporary India. At CPR, she is engaged in building up a new initiative on state capacity. She is also a non-resident visiting scholar at the Center for Advanced Studies of India at University of Pennsylvania. She has trained at Harvard University, University of Cambridge, and at University College London. There she completed her PhD in anthropology as a UCL Global Excellence Scholar. Today she is going to speak about agri-markets. Understanding how agricultural mandis function is critical to understanding marketing system in India. Since 1960s, most of the states in India, as we all have heard, we already are aware of, have adopted APMC Acts, kept amending it to various degrees. But it will be interesting to know what has happened over the course of time. What is the current state of affairs with agri-mandis across countries? Even with so much controversy about farm laws, agri-mandis have become all the more important, has gained a lot of importance in popular media. And as in the morning also Professor Khera was telling us, there are many misconceptions. There are many myths associated with it also. So I'm guessing Professor Krishnamurthy, she will share her insights from her field studies on agri-markets, her research, and tell us more about all of it. Now, Mekhala, the stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Cheta. It's a great pleasure to be here, and many congratulations to CDS and to all of you for putting together such an inspiring and exciting series. I think most of us who have been invited to speak saw the lineup and felt, well, we could just clear our week and join you and sit in and listen to all of these lectures ourselves. I was also telling Dr. Chatterjee that I think the reason all of us said yes is exactly the same. The Center for Development Studies is a really important institution, I think, for all of us trying to learn historically and grapple with the issues facing contemporary agriculture. So I think it's just a wonderful opportunity. I very much hope to be able to visit in person soon. But I know you have Dr. Mihisha after bringing all of this to a close, and I heard such amazing things through about his PhD and the kind of community of scholars that have really made CDS, and so it's a really great privilege and pleasure to be here today. As was said in the introduction, I am going to talk about agricultural markets. I think the context of the farm laws and the last year and a half has meant that mandis have got a lot more airtime than they usually get. I often joke that when I began my doctoral work, which was in 2008, there were, at least in anthropology, many more mall ethnographies than there were mandi ethnographies. And almost tragically, I'm finishing, hopefully this year, a book manuscript that captures the work in Madhya Pradesh to begin with. And it's one of the first full-length, actually the first full-length ethnography of a grain mandi. This says something, I think, not so much about the importance of mandis, but the problems in terms of our own neglect of agricultural markets. These are obviously absolute lifelines, connecting systems of production and consumption, connecting town and countryside, connecting politics and economy, and at the heart of social life, and yet we understand them very, very poorly. Barbara Harris-White has talked about this for years, but for some reason, there is a persistent neglect. So they are at once incredibly visible, volatile, politically charged, many generalizations, but incredibly poorly understood. And there has been very little empirical work that has actually been done to grapple with their complexity, their dynamism, and their diversity. So the talk that I want to give, and I'll just share my screen today, and I really invite everyone. You can see this now, yeah. It's
Yes,
visible? Yeah,
yes,
great.
yes.
Invite everybody to stop, pause, interrupt me as I go along if you have any questions. But I actually thought we will begin with this, organize this talk around this question about diversity of agricultural markets and their diversity and integration and why this actually matters. And the reason I wanted to do this is that throughout the farm law debate, there were huge generalizations that were made about APMCs being the basic roadblock to everything, to the way in which procurement was happening in certain parts of the world, parts of the country being generalized to the entire country. And those of us who've been doing this work kept pausing and saying, agriculture is a state subject. We further paused and said, actually, that's not true. Markets are different in different places, depending on the commodity, depending on the region. And we would get a lot of glazed expressions. At most, people would acknowledge this is important, but then sort of not really get why it's important for policy. And then they would say, it's all this very too complex, and then it's too specific, and we need some general guidelines. So I wanted to take up, first and foremost, this question about why does diversity really matter, and why should we bother from a policy point of view with agricultural diversity, but then to go from there to really think about, therefore, from all of this fieldwork people have done over the years, what is the common threads? What can we build on? What is the common ground that we can also find? So that's what I'm going to attempt to do over the next, hour and a bit that we have in this session. So the usual critique is, this is India, everything is diverse. We are like this only. Diversity and complexity are great when you want to critique policies and say, oh, Kerala is different, oh, Tamil Nadu is different, but Meghalaya is different. But they're not particularly constructive. It is curious, sure, but not really very consequential. Then there are those who actually take diversity seriously, but then said, okay, diversity is all very good when we are thinking at small scales, but really we need large scale solutions and large scale transformations in India, and that's where diversity is, really not very helpful to think with. The second thing is that, we actually have a pejorative understanding of diversity, where we think about diversity as enabling fragmentation and an impediment to the integration of markets. And because we are talking so much about national markets, diversity is seen as fragmentation, which is another problematic sort of framing. And then finally, the word diversity is tied up with diversification. So we're not sure what to make of market diversity, and we naturally think about it in terms of crop diversification, or we're thinking about it in terms of economic diversification of economic portfolios in farm and non-farm. And so this term diversity is different from diversification, but it is deeply tied up with it. So these are all the kinds of problems that we get. I would like to actually say, something that is a starting principle for those of us who have done field work in agricultural markets. It's something that the work of Barbara Harris-White, who has done extensive and long-term work on markets, has always made clear. But I think anybody who spends a considerable amount of time in agricultural markets will understand this, that empirical specification is actually a general requirement when it comes to thinking about agricultural markets. Empirical specification is not something that exemplifies general conditions, but it is actually important for us to understand generally that we have to specify, because this is how markets also work. Nothing is in a market happens without specification. No price in an agricultural market is ever given by any serious buyer without tagging it to a specific quality and a variety and a volume. So specification is how markets work, and specification is incredibly important at every stage of understanding the dynamics of agricultural markets. Market diversity is not something that is merely descriptive. It is actually about variations in market structure, which is linked, of course, to agricultural and agrarian structure, market organization, to the range of processes that happen at different stages of exchange and movement, and relationships and relations. It is about interactions and changes over time. So it is not a description, this is a cotton market or this is a subsistence production system. It is deeply tied up with all of these questions: structure, organization, process, relation, and it is about interactions and dynamism over time. Most importantly, agricultural markets are really embedded in a whole system of interrelationships. So you cannot understand markets without understanding the relationships between production, exchange, processing, distribution, and consumption. When we say supply and demand, we usually think supply, demand, production, consumption. But the dynamics of exchange, processing, and distribution are critically engaged with production and with consumption and exchange. And you can't understand the terms of engagement with exchange and therefore what farmers get as price without actually understanding the interlinkages between each of these different kinds of elements in any agricultural production system. Diversity matters for policy for the following reasons. When we move from, when we start taking diversity seriously, we move from assumptions about agricultural markets and start paying attention to how agricultural markets and state intervention actually works in practice. So this field on agricultural markets is riddled with a whole set of absolutely empirically problematic assumptions. And as soon as you take diversity seriously, you move from those assumptions to an understanding. They also help you think about common characteristics. So when we think about diversity, we tend to think, oh my God, all you're going to get is a whole picture of fragmentation. Everything is different from everything else. But only by taking diversity seriously can you actually begin to do an understanding of common characteristics of relationships as they work in context and on variations and typologies, which is really helpful for policy because it helps you typologize and categorize and think about the relationships between things. The other thing that's very important for policy, and diversity helps you pay attention to this, is that it helps you pay attention to the necessary preconditions. Because actually often when we bring about reforms, we don't pay much attention to the preconditions under which those reforms would work well, particularly when it comes to the kind of role the state must play or the kinds of capacities you must have in place, institutional capacities to make certain regulatory reforms work or to bring producer companies into place. There are a whole range of preconditions that we need to invest in. And there are common principles, different mechanisms and approaches, but the principles can be common. So again, when you want to pay attention to principles, preconditions, is very helpful. And it also helps you understand the potentials and limitations of working with policy. So basically, it moves us away from policy prescriptions to actually thinking creatively about policy frameworks that allow us to bring together the kinds of different inputs, different kinds of features and factors that we need to make market work and to support farmers, and to think about transition pathways. So it brings a dynamism, right? Like Punjab is not Punjab forever, and it's not a static place, even though we've seen green revolution agriculture for a certain number of decades. There's a lot of dynamism here. The same with the way in which we categorize a Bihar or a UP or a Madhya Pradesh, and we have certain ideas about entrenchment. We don't pay enough attention to pathways, to trajectories, to unfolding. And it forces us to think in ways that are both more comprehensive and more contextual. Now, this is really important. Yeah.
1 minute. Are you moving, shifting, changing slides?
I am
on the title side.
I'm on the same. No, I've moved slides. You didn't get slides. Didn't move with me. Let me try.
No, it is now we can't see your slide.
Okay. Now I share it again. Let me try and share it again. Can you see the slides now?
Yes.
And are you seeing the slide called Diversity Matters?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So now, sorry. So I think you missed the first few things, but I'm now on this slide, why it matters for policy.
Yeah.
And the point I want to make here is that often we think comprehensive and contextual go against each other. Again, contextual means we have to look in a particular place and it doesn't apply. But what agriculture needs is more comprehensive thinking and more contextual thinking. Again, when people like Mihir will talk later about location specificity, it is not fragmented. It is about being comprehensive and contextual. And actually, when you move towards that, whether it's integration, whether it's thinking comprehensively, we actually need more coordination rather than more uniformity, right? And here we must pay attention also to the fact that integration, particularly in agriculture and agricultural markets, also has consequences. It's not a win-win for everybody. Tita, I'm just going to try and full screen, and now I've changed slides. Can you see? Is it shifting?
Moving from assumptions about agriculture, diversity matters for policy. That's the
Yeah.
slide.
Has it moved to the next slide?
Field research, field research.
Now you're seeing field research. I think if I put it on full screen, you're not seeing the slide.
Yeah, maybe this is fine. We can read the slides.
Okay, I'll keep it like this. I think this way you get to see. Okay, so now that I've hopefully established some context for why it's really important to take diversity seriously, I also want to pause on the fact that it's really, really difficult to do. And it is not at all an easy business to actually grapple with diversity, complexity, and with the dynamism of agricultural markets. So my own work, which has happened over the last decade or so, has really been very much driven by a field-based and inspired by field-based research, and research that has happened over many years by economists, by field economists particularly, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, and to some extent geographers as well. And so it's very interdisciplinary, and I learned a lot from existing work, but like I said, it's actually surprisingly thin. And I was rereading, the edited volume 1985, K. and Raj et al., and all of you know of this book, Essays on the Commercialization of Indian Agriculture, and they talk precisely there about how thin this has been. The richness has actually come from historians, interestingly enough. It's historical work that still has remained amongst the richest. Both economists and anthropologists and sociologists haven't done anywhere near the kind of justice that is required for these markets. My own work has built on long-term ethnographic fieldwork in Madhya Pradesh, where I studied one mandi and one mandi town over its biography of 150 years, paying close attention to the last 50 years of change, but sweeping back about 150 years to understand the context and change in this market and its regulatory history and life. And then I've had the opportunity over the last decade to do comparative research with collaborators, first in Bihar and Karnataka, where we studied Bihar, Karnataka, and MP with Jeffrey Witso and colleagues at IIM Bangalore. And then most recently in the CASI Agricultural Markets Project, where we studied Bihar, Odisha, Punjab with Sumitra Chatterjee, Devesh Kapoor, and Marshall Bhuton. And that was a collaboration between anthropologists, economists, political scientists. So the attempt has been to study markets across states, districts, commodity systems, and over time. And I want to share today some of the, rich learnings I think that we've had, but also that have actually been common wisdom for a rather long time. And why we need to return to some of this as we go forward. So before I do that, just a quick set of definitions. And I think it's really important because our public debates, but even our academic debates, slip and slide very sloppily over all of these concepts. There is the concept of the economic market. There is then the particular relations of production, marketing, processing, consumption. There are the relationships of exchange, circulation, and distribution. There is a difference between spot markets, like what mandis are, where you have physical spot markets. You can have electronic spot markets, which are still spot markets, and futures markets, which are derivatives markets. As I said, spot markets can be physical and electronic. Futures markets are typically electronic markets, but you can make a futures contract physically. And we have a very long and interesting history of futures and speculation in agricultural commodity markets before we had electronic exchanges. We have primary, secondary, and tertiary markets. These are quite different. When we talk about agricultural markets and mandis, we are talking about primary wholesale markets, primary physical wholesale markets. Secondary and tertiary markets have very different dynamics. There are also very different dynamics between wholesale and retail markets. I think Harish Damodran often quotes farmers from all the way from the US, and farmers in Madhya Pradesh say the same thing, that farmers always sell in wholesale and buy in retail. right? So within your own markets, whether you're looking at inputs and whether farmers are able to engage with wholesale exchange, or even when they buy after selling in a mandi, that typically small farmers will buy in retail, large farmers have the capacity to buy to some extent in wholesale, but farmers suffer different terms of engagement in both of these, and the markets themselves are very, very differently organized. We tend to completely confuse sites of exchange and marketplaces, right? There are multiple market sites. A village is often a site of exchange. And for many, many farmers across India, it's a site of exchange. It is not a marketplace often, whereas a mandi is a regulated marketplace. A hart is a marketplace. It's also a site of exchange. The new laws muddied this whole thing even more, confused things, and made a distinction between trade areas and market areas. And we are very confused between marketing and trading. Whereas marketing is something farmers do, and we also think about marketing as something retailers do, and trading is something done between two trading parties. So these are very common confusions. And as a result, we have very great legislative problems because we are not clear about what we're talking about here. There are different buyers and sellers, but there are also, of course, as we know, principals and agents. So we have lots of commission agents, brokers, other kinds of intermediaries working between buyers and sellers. But often they are also partially buyers, they are also sellers, they may also do commission agency. Processors and logistics operators are also wholesalers and often also do a little bit of stocking. And so we have portfolio capitalists in this system. Very many entities do multiple things, and all of this comes into an agricultural marketing system. We equally have a lot of complexity when it comes to thinking about the state in Indian agriculture. So there's a whole set of concepts and definitions when we're thinking about the market, but there's also a lot of confusion and complexity when we're thinking about the state. So there's a difference within and across regions. There are center-state relations and dynamics, and there are inter- and intra-sectoral linkages and dynamics. Over the years, we have seen all of this evolve. There has been a multiplication of roles. There's a lot of confusion about territoriality because administrative categories do not always go across trading categories, and we have different kinds of zones here. There are lots of contradiction and competing goals, and there are silos and fragmentations is with the developmental state across India. So there's the land revenue state, there's the irrigation state, there's the forest and forestry state, there's the famine relief and food security state. There is the scientific state, the extension state, the creditor state, there's the cooperative state. The state is a producer, it has plantations, and it also produces other kinds of inputs and seeds. There's the state as a procurer, trader, and distributor. The regulatory state overlays and goes in and out of all of this. There's infrastructure that is produced, and there is the welfare state. And increasingly, agriculture is often also thought of as a welfare sector rather than as a dynamic economic sector. So these are the kinds of variations we see. So I would plea for clarity on our definitions, care in how we define different elements of the market and the economy, and much more care on how we think about the state as well, because this has been a multiple and overlapping sort of trajectory. So commercialization and developmental evolution has happened in very complex ways. And that is actually what that book, Commercialization of Indian Agriculture was trying to point us to, understanding these interrelationships. So just to give you a sense of how this works out in practice, in many cases, you will have the same region, for example, Madhya Pradesh. You'll have different commodities sold in the same market site with different market systems and processes. So, for example, soybean and wheat are both sold in Harda Mandi. It's the same region, it's the same market site. They're two different commodities. They have very different market systems. One is a largely entirely private market system with plants and processors. The other, especially since 2008, has a big role for the government, and in the off-season a role for millers and other actors as well. So wheat and soybean too, an oilseed and a major domestic food grain, very, very different. In Punjab's mandis, basmati and non-basmati paddy, and these are two different crops. They are paddy, but basmati is not the same as a commodity as non-basmati rice. Again, paddy, completely different marketing systems. One is dominated by private actors, there's export markets, regional millers, and we have a non-basmati, which is overwhelmingly and almost entirely procured by the state and done through artyas and commission agents. Artyas play a role in both markets, but they have a very different role in both markets. In other cases, you have the same region, you have different commodities, you have different market sites and systems. This is often the case in markets for food grains versus markets for fruits and vegetables, where the fruit and vegetable mandi, the sabzi mandi, will be a separate site, governed differently, often regulated differently, with different dynamics. In other cases, you'll have the same commodity, different regions, different market sites and systems. I'll show you this for one commodity, paddy, in a few minutes. Other cases, you have the same region, you have the same commodity, but you have a different sub-region, and you will have different market sites and systems. So we saw this with paddy in Sambalpur and Balasore, or in chili markets in Sambalpur and Balasore. In East and West MP, same state, very different commodity marketing systems in the two regions, sub-regions, and within the same blocks in Harda. If you look at Redgaon versus Harda block within Harda district, very different marketing systems and dynamics. And finally, in the same region, you'll have differential terms of engagement with markets, where large and small farmers or irrigated and unirrigated farmers, farmers with different kinds of interlocked transactions will have different kinds of engagements in terms of how they can engage with markets, the kinds of prices they can realize, the ways in which measures are taken, the way in which payment settlement has happened, and the kinds of costs that they bear. So again, that's the dynamics of differentiation. So just to give you, with all of that, we have some very common assumptions. Now we know this, I've just taken you through this, but if you look at the dominant debate about APMCs and mandis, the assumptions are as follows: that APMC mandis are the dominant site of exchange, that Indian farmers are trapped inside mandis, selling all their commodities and all their surplus of, rapacious traders or commission agents within mandis. We have a very dominant assumption that is regulatory restrictions that are the primary barrier facing farmers and firms in India. That more firms would come in if regulation was more pliant, and that farmers are not able to sell whatever they want. We have a very strong conception and misconception in most cases where intermediaries are simply considered exploitative, inefficient, and that they all make large margins. We also assume that interlocked markets are the norm. In some cases they are, but we have to look at, is this a generalization? How has this changed over time? But again, the characterization is that money lender traders control everything, and this is how markets actually operate. And finally, we have a very strong assumption that procurement is really limited to Punjab and Haryana, and that procurement systems are similar across states. Again, it's Artyas and money lenders and FCI everywhere. And that across these states it's very similar, and actually no other state really benefits like Punjab and Haryana. And of course there is a historical story here. You've heard from Richa Kumar and the whole story of the Green Revolution, but again these are very dominant assumptions which are very much at cross purposes with what I've just presented to you. So just so that since post lunch everybody has some visuals to get their eyes up here, it gives you a sense in a mandi of the different lot sizes that come in. Here's a clear picture of differentiation. These are small farmers who have come with multiple lots. On the same trolley here, you see a larger farmer who's bought a full trolley load of soybean, and you see smaller farmers who have also rented their way with a single bag. These are traders sampling soybean from the bags, and later they will sample soybean from the trolleys. Here you can see in wheat procurement season, a huge load of wheat that has been brought in. Very different dynamics here. It's not actually traders who are buying, but the state, which is why all the wheat has been kept in one big heap. We see what the mandi looked like in 2008, as this is now 2009 spring, where again in the Rabi marketing season, the mandi was full of bags. To make the point I was trying to make about distribution of APMCs and the diversity across regions, here's an interesting map just to take a look. So this was all the dynamics within one mandi, right? I've just shown you how different life looks for different farmers, different sizes, different crops in one mandi over a year in Kharif and Rabi. Within a similar, in a common state, you see the A category mandis. These are the large blue balls, points here. They are dominated, you can see, and clustered very much in west and central MP. But as you go east, and you go past east of Jabalpur, where are the A-class mandis? You don't see them here. The cropping patterns change, the presence of infrastructure changes, the degree of commercialization changes, and some of these places have very vibrant commercial markets, but you don't see well-regulated, well-established mandis. Just as in the westernmost part, also in Java, you will see a similar deficit of good quality mandis. This was the point I was making about paddy procurement. Now, where are the APMCs? In Bihar, farmers do not sell in APMC mandis. They sell in the village to village intermediaries. There are procurement centers, but they are hardly in use. And what you see is really sale to village intermediaries. This is a paddy procurement and paddy supply chain or network in Bihar. This is the same chain of paddy in Balasore in Odisha. Right, you see the difference. Paddy purchasing centers are more prominent part here. And then there's village trader, but there's far less complexity in this chain and many less smaller actors. But you see that the state is playing a slightly more important role here than it is there. But again, most of the sales are happening at the village level. This is Hoshiarpur in Punjab. Look at the paddy procurement network. Virtually all the non-basmati paddy is sold straight in the mandi to artyas, and then to procurement agencies. It goes to millers and comes back from the custom miller, and it goes out into nutrition programs in the state. Look at this. Look at just these three chains. This is one commodity, paddy, non-basmati paddy, in all three of these places. But look within a single state, Sambalpur has a rather different system where you see a lot more paddy purchase centers. This is a state where they have a large farmers union. The Hirakud Dam, so the irrigation situation in this part of the state is much better in Sambalpur district. It has a bigger procurement network, much more mobilized farmers unions. Koraput, right? Again, not far, similar, same state, very different district. And here again, it's largely the large farmers who go to the paddy purchase center. Most small farmers sell in the village, or they store to sell later. And you see a very different dynamic. So again, just within two districts of the same state, same commodity, paddy, right? So these are the kinds of dynamics. And now we look at a different commodity in Koraput, which is ginger. And ginger it's a big market here. It's done largely through aggregators who come locally, and they call kantawalas, or intermediaries, jaleris, traders in the heart, and commission agents also functioning in the heart, and then retailers. And a good amount of this actually goes outside the district and outside Odisha to traders from other states. So again, just to give you a visual of some of these sites of exchange, they are far cry from the dominant vision of APMC mandis taking over procurement or controlling most commodity exchange. This is in Sambalpur, Odisha. And here again, you understand that if you spend time on the ground, you suddenly see very different dynamics. This is a hart run by the Gram Panchayat. The regulating market committee then took it over 2 years ago. The sheds and platforms have been built by the RMC, and the shop rents have actually been reduced. In Sambalpur, in Odisha, again in Solbagra, the primary market for chili growing is in Kuchinda and Bamra. There's been a fall of production recently. The government tried to set up ENAM, but this is actually the ENAM market. Trade is happening outside in the Solbagra market, but this is the market the state has set up. But no commodity actually goes in and is traded here. So infrastructure has been set up, ENAM has been set up, but it is actually happening outside, right? In Nalanda, this is potato sacks lined up to be taken from a large farmer's farm directly, sold to the trader in May 19. The labor loading and unloading is provided by the trader in this particular case. Again, this is in Nalanda. This is a sale of wheat at a farmer's household. There's a large Brahmin farmer who's able to actually negotiate one-on-one and have a system for negotiating and accepting delayed payments from traders. So the question of his bargaining power is different. This is Bihar Sharif Mandi early in the morning in the peak season, and you can see This market actually comes under the SDO. This is Nalanda Bihar Sharif market by the afternoon. So depending on the time of day, these markets look completely different. The sites look completely different. The dynamics are completely different. So, this gives you this sense. Now, just, I want to also show you a few pieces of data that, again, myth bust some really very, very dominant myths. Again, we talk so much about marketable surplus. India is a country with surplus. All farmers have huge surplus now, wheat and paddy, etc. But here you see, at least in Bihar and Orissa, and it's a very different story in Punjab, as you can see, we found that about 45 to 50% of farmers actually have marketable surplus. There is still a large number of farmers who produce for own consumption and depending on the crop. So here you can see mustard is barely sold in the market, but even for potato and for paddy, you're seeing, much less in Bihar. Maize is a much more cash-oriented crop in the places that we were looking at, particularly in a district like Samastipur or in Purnia, where again nearly 60% of the maize was sold, right? So you see this dynamic. Then where do farmers sell? Again, you can see the dynamics. In most places, it is the farm gate. Nalanda, Purnia, Samastipur, Baleshwar. Again, largely in the farm gate. In Koraput, you see hearts come up as a very important site. We've separated here for paddy is in the top and cereals, pulses, oilseeds at the bottom. Hoshiarpur, look at the green line. It's the mandi, right? Virtually everything is going to the mandi. A certain amount of cereal pulses, and largely, are coming here, are sold at the farm gate. But very striking diversity, right? And you see the site of sale. So it is the larger farmers, that go to the mandi. In Hoshiarpur, all farmers go to the mandi. But in Bihar, you will see that it is the larger farmers that go more to the mandi or to further sites of sale, right, or to other villages. But in Hoshiarpur, it's actually agnostic. All farmers, large and small, all of them go to the mandi. Here again, you see great diversity in methods of weighing. And this is very important because, as we know, in markets, there are price and non-price functions. So there's an auction which will determine price, but weighment and payment are two of the places where farmers are most exploited, both in terms of theft of grain as well as in terms of the unfavorable terms of settlement, if they're not paid immediately or they've taken a loan, etc. So, but here again, really important, both in terms of weighing, we can see there's a lot of diversity, but some interesting things, right? Hoshiarpur, biggest market, lot of mandi, mostly manual weighing. And actually we saw electronic weigh bridges in much more small competitive markets in parts of Bihar and Orissa. Doesn't mean those were not weighted against farmers, because when our farmers went to get weighing scales, the seller of the weighing scale said, do you want it to be weighted like the traders weight theirs? Of course, there is conning there too. But it's interesting that in Punjab, after all these years, farmers have still not been able to move the system to electronic weighing. Again, really important myth busting on the time taken to receive full payment. We assume that in these markets, farmers do not have immediate settlement from intermediaries. That intermediaries take a long time to settle, right? But actually the longest time to settle is taken in Hoshiarpur, again, where the state is a major buyer of paddy or artyas are buyers. In most of the other places, particularly if you look at the smaller markets and you see these are the intermediaries, the immediate payment is pretty high. So most of these are cash transactions done immediately with intermediaries and farmers. We did not find a lot of interlocking here. We found much more interlocking in Hoshiarpur, a bigger market with bigger farmers and with commission agents and artyas. Whereas the intermediated trade between intermediaries and small farmers, there was actually quicker turnover. And again, this completely, myth busts. Lots of talk about agri-tech, but if you start actually going to the field in places like Bihar, Odisha, and Punjab, even in Punjab, you will see much less than you expect in terms of mobile usage. The vast majority of payments happen in cash and check. In Hoshiarpur, because again, it's government, so it's 55 to 43 is done in check. But look at the other districts, right? Now, everything is over 95%, 95 and above. And so when we are starting to talk about all this mobile infrastructure and digital trade, we need to really question whether we are there at all yet, and what does it mean when we make these kinds of moves. Finally, I just want to show you how diverse the procurement systems are. And Madhya Pradesh is another state where I know the procurement system relatively well, and I've studied closely how changes in procurement actually happen. But Bihar has a negligible number of farmers actually selling to packs. There is very, very little actual procurement that happens. Odisha, on the other hand, is a state that has paid a lot of attention to its procurement system. It has an almost entirely and very impressive PPAS system, is digitized. They have found out a way to include tenant farmers and sharecroppers in the system. But even there, we saw that it was large farmers who were able to make better use of procurement than small farmers. We saw places like Sambalpur where you have a strong farmers movement able to get better procurement, both in terms of the volume procured by the state, as well as the kind of engagement that they have on quality and other kinds of specifications. Not all procurement centers have good infrastructure. There is a Katni Chatni system where you set the amount of deduction that will happen, and a lot of that depends on the bargaining power of farmers in that particular area. Whereas in Punjab, it's a much more streamlined system. There farmers of all sizes sell to the FCI, through government agencies via the Artiya. It is an entrenched system. It is an interlocked system. That is an important part of the system, is that farmers do take a lot of credit still from Artiyas. And we see that these dynamics are very hard to shift. So both in Punjab and Haryana, there have been attempts to now do direct sales to farmers, bypass the Artiyas. There's always been historically a lot of resistance, and there still is. So this is all just to point out the kinds of diversity that you see. Let me pause for a minute and see whether there are any questions here. And otherwise, then I can move to, taking you through the last bit of what I think are some of the implications of looking at all of this diversity. And what kind of lessons do we have to learn then if we know that such diversity is the norm? Are there any questions just on, thinking through some of this material or on the relationships and dynamics? Anything? No?
If you have questions, please unmute yourself. Yes, there's someone.
Yes.
There was two photographs that you showed. One about government created infrastructure where there was no sale happening, and it was happening outside the market. What is the reason for this? Why it would not have? Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, this was a place where traders did not want to enter the regulated market. Because this is a district and part of Odisha. Odisha has one of the oldest APMC acts, but for the longest time there was very little investment in actually building good mandis, and farmers and traders could sell anywhere around. So there was just a simple system of checkpoints. Actually, not so simple. It was rent-seeking system, but you had checkposts where you collected some amount as commodities moved across different points, but there was no regulated trade. So traders had got used to selling in another market outside, and they didn't want to. Now, if you come on to Enam, you have to do your payments through the portal. You have to move your payments from cash payments to check payments, or through online to bank transfers. You have to do all the bidding through an electronic portal. And these were simply not even farmers traders who even ran a proper auction. Right? In most markets that we saw in Bihar and Odisha, there was no open outcry auction. Whereas in districts of, for example, in Karnataka, where in mandis, for example, for pulses, where there is a system of manual tendering, right? Or in Harda Mandi, where I worked, there was a system of open outcry auction. So all the farmers would come and then they would line up, and then traders would go one after the other. Where there is an auction happening, you can conceivably move it to electronic bidding. So in Karnataka, they moved from manual tendering to electronic tendering, right? In Madhya Pradesh, you could try, and where you have an open outcry auction, move it to an electronic auction. But where you simply don't have an auction at all, where traders have figured out their own systems for storage, for movement, near the rakes, etc., where they don't wish to come and buy inside the mandi. The mandi officials, the RMC officials were absolutely frustrated because they said we can neither get the traders to sell nor to buy, nor the farmers to sell inside this market. And they had a situation where they forced a trader to buy, to put it on the platform, to buy crops. This was mirchi, and the trader didn't even collect it. So it just stayed there. That amount of crop just stayed in the market. Nobody knew how to dispose it, where to put it. So, when you have so much bilateral engagement between farmers and traders, where the market sites are informal, where they have historically been unregulated, simply getting them to be regulated is very tough. So what would have been better is to look at where is the market. Is there a way of actually entering that market site and bringing some better oversight, some better regulation, some better auctioning methods within that market, ensuring that farmers have good price information within the actually existing market? What you otherwise have is markets on paper and real markets on the field. And a lot of ENAM transactions that we have actually observed over the last several years, we have seen these ENAM transactions. People are simply taking offline transactions and putting them online, or it's actually not reflecting the process that should happen. And this is part of the problem. I'll talk a little more about the implications. But when we create this kind of infrastructure without understanding the way the market is actually structured and set up, in another place, actually farmers have been asking, again in parts of Sambalpur, what we saw is that farmers had actually been asking, and in Balasore as well, for chili markets, where they were being held ransom by the local intermediaries. They were asking for regulated mandis, but the state did not provide them, right? Then you come with ENAM. What farmers wanted was a regulated market site, somewhere where they can go, where the state is present, where an open auction could happen. But instead you give them something like ENAM and it completely threw off the market. And almost simultaneously the market tanked for other reasons and everybody blamed it on ENAM. So, even that was not fair. We heard a lot of things where people were saying, oh, this ENAM came and the market crashed. So the market was crashing for other reasons. So again, it's a misunderstanding of how the market operates. But what we saw across sites was that ENAM sampling stations were being used to make khichdi for the market staff. Things were simply not being used. A lot of the computers were just locked and kept. And there was very, very low interest. And it's because you're not understanding how the actual market functions. So again, it's not to say that farmers don't know how to use technology or traders don't know how to use technology. But you have to be clear what is the problem you're trying to solve and who are you trying to solve it for. And for most farmers in these markets, what they want is good accessible price information. What they want is well-regulated local sites where they can actually go and participate in trade. So I think these are the kinds of things we haven't invested in. And the reason you see so much exchange happening in primary sites, in villages and in local hearts is because we never invested. For these 70 odd years, even though from 50, 60, 70s, we've been talking about mandis, we actually never invested in them. So, even the Doubling Farmers Income Report says we are short of around 4,000 mandis in this country. The entire network, which 22,000 hearts, we have a grams, new scheme. Nothing has happened under that scheme. We have been talking about upgrading our regulation and investment and infrastructure in hearts for decades. But people haven't done it. And the truth is, these are state subjects. So it is for the states to do it. And where you see relatively better infrastructure, whether it is in a Punjab or a Haryana, or you see it in parts of Maharashtra and parts of Karnataka, in parts of Madhya Pradesh, it is the state governments who have actually taken the lead and built that. But it is uneven. It is poorly concentrated. It is deeply concentrated in certain richer areas. It hasn't spread all over. We haven't actually provided either mandis or proper regulatory functionaries. So this is a very sad story. And then we come with technology and some techno vision that farmers will sell everything on WhatsApp. Or what you need is well-regulated physical markets. And that is an area for public investment. So are there any other questions? Otherwise, this is a nice way to just quickly wrap up a few
Oh, ma'am, I have one more
thoughts.
question.
Yeah,
Yes,
go
Uh,
sir.
ahead.
you're
And then I
saying
think
about
Rohit has a question as well.
okay,
Yeah.
this in the market where the procurement happened largely by the government, a large amount of the settlement were done in check. So, does the farmers in reality have the literacy and all this to go to a bank, or do they prefer this mode of thing, or is it like a compulsion from the government side?
Yeah.
Why?
So in Punjab and Haryana, I think farmers are very comfortable with check payments. I found even in Madhya Pradesh, when they switched to a check payment system, farmers did not have a problem. The problem was whether the ATMs would have the money and whether the rural branches would have enough for them to easily withdraw. So if you do check payments, you have to make sure that your rural banking system is good enough. Farmers actually sometimes prefer check payments because when they take a lot of cash on their person, there's a lot of looting, there's a lot of worry of theft. They stuff them in their clothes and they stuff them in fertilizer bags, but it's always a little unsafe. So neither farmers nor traders like to carry huge amounts of cash around anymore. But what is really important is that usually at the time of settlement, when you're coming to sell, farmers have a whole range of other things they need to buy. So if you have to wait a long time, often labor has to be paid off, sometimes, especially in the Kharif season, you have to buy seed, for all these other things have to be procured and kept ready for the next season. So sometimes diesel costs. So farmers have lots of reasons for small amounts of cash. So what the MP system did, which was quite good, is that they gave a self-check for 10,000 rupees or a certain proportion in cash and then the rest in check. So there are creative solutions to this problem. You're absolutely right that a lot of the time it is the state bringing imposition, but there has been a spread of the banking infrastructure. I find a lot of farmers are quite comfortable using it. It is, especially in the states where procurement has been happening, even in Odisha, it's bank payments that happen, and farmers are quite capable of transacting with that system. But the ease of withdrawal is very important there, right? If you're not able to withdraw, and then the second big challenge farmers are having with some of these procurement systems is that it's very tough for sharecroppers to gain because it's linked to the land ownership. So unless you have active efforts in systems, so that's why actually in Punjab it's less of a problem because it's done through the artiyas, and the artiyas do the spot payment. You don't have so much of a problem, and so that system has worked. So in Punjab and Haryana, you see more inclusion in the system. In other states, they're trying to move towards that, which is, I think, a very good thing. Again, none of this is to be defeatist. Like when I saw the system, they change very dynamically. So you can solve problems if you have an intention to solve the problem. It's not impossible. But yeah, I mean that these markets are overwhelmingly cash otherwise, and farmers also have a good system of like if they're growing one crop which is cash based and the other which is sold to the state and gets check, they will manage their money in such a way that they'll take the cash part in there's an onions or potatoes or vegetables, and then they will take for whatever goes to the state in check. So you see a lot of changes there, but you're right. I think if the government doesn't take proactive steps, it can be quite inconvenient. I think those problems are becoming less of an issue now. But again, it takes many years, so you have to get used to doing procurement. I think Rohit had a question.
Yes, Professor. So this
Yeah.
is a follow-up to what Shamila's raised. So in the graphs that you showed, it looked like Hoshiarpur was sort of an outlier. So what I was interested was, are these like delays in payments relative to other spaces or the higher proportion of non-cash payments? Are all of these a result of the fact that the scale of operations in general are too high for the farmers to come to an equilibrium, or is it the presence of a state and the associated frictions that's making this a much
Yeah.
more complex than it is in other places?
Yeah, so it's really important to keep in mind Hoshiarpur is not an outlier in Punjab. It is a outlier, or in Punjab and Haryana. It is an outlier in comparison to Eastern India, and it would be an outlier even in comparison to other parts of North or South India, right? Because Punjab and Haryana are very different. But within Punjab and Haryana, I think the system is fairly well understood. So farmers plan their money in such a way that the delay is not a huge problem. See, every year there are problems for farmers. Procurement has to start on time. Procurement money has to come on time. Right now, last year procurement was too late. This year, government is not able to get its hands on wheat because the market prices are much higher than the MSP, not much higher, but at least higher, even in Punjab and Haryana. So it depends on the dynamics in each season. And in Hoshiarpur, where you're selling to the state, you will, as a farmer, be prepared for a certain delay if you're taking a check payment. One of the reasons farmers continue to have relationships with Artyas is because Artyas give credit and cash all of the time, anytime, for all kinds of expenses, including consumption expenses. This is a big reason why farmers don't entirely move away from them, right? And if you want to transition a system, now tomorrow if the state says, no, we will not buy through Artyas and we will buy directly from farmers, and the Artyas will say, we will not give you credit, right? The state will get scared. But if the state insists that they will buy from farmers, the Artyas won't be able to do anything. This is what they did in Madhya Pradesh. In 1980s, the state simply called the bluff of the intermediaries. They said, okay, don't give credit. We will buy from the farmers. You don't give credit. What happened? The credit market actually moved out of the mandi to the bazaar, right? Farmers actually moved their systems to sell to the state and to get on with the mandi, and then traders also returned to the mandi. Now, the thing is that you can move things around, but usually to get these kinds of changes, you have to change something in the production system. So if you want to delink commodity trade from credit, you have to do better on credit. You just have to get farmers better, more timely access to credit, institutional credit. Or you change the procurement dynamic, the production dynamics, so farmers are doing less input intensive agriculture and therefore need to take less loans, right? Something has to change. The problem is we try to fix only one thing, right? Like just the payment delay. It may not be the biggest problem. Or people are trying to, improve quality assaying, and they found it made no difference to the prices farmers were getting. So there's a reason farmers don't grade. In most of these states, we found farmers don't bother grading. And we found because when they graded, it didn't give them higher prices. Now, we may want to solve the grading problem, but unless the grading problem is an economic problem, it's not going to get solved. For which we need to understand the full dynamics of the market. Why is grading not a big issue for these farmers, right? What is the nature of consumption that traders are able to manage without so much grading? What is the nature of margins in these different places? So, in my experience, again, one has to understand the particular dynamic. In some ways, Hoshiarpur is the simplest market, where most people sell wheat and paddy, grow wheat and paddy, and sell wheat and paddy via Artyas to the state. Whereas a farmer in Bihar or Odisha has to think a lot more and deal with many more actors at any given point for their different commodities, right? It's less monocropped and more complex. But I can come back and we can clarify some of these further.
Thank you so much. That was very comprehensive.
Great. Any other questions, or shall I just take you through the last few slides and then maybe that will inspire some more questions as well. So here, I just wanted to say, okay, where do we go then, right? I've shown you all this complexity and all of this diversity. And I think where we go is to remind ourselves of the principles and purpose of policy and of state intervention, right? And I think this was one of the biggest problems with the farm law debate. We never went back to the original thinking. We never asked what are the basic conditions for public regulation and have they really changed? So as you can see in these markets, they are markets with a lot of asymmetries. And more than that, in any given region or a sub-region, you have many sellers and few buyers. right? So that means you have a tendency towards oligopsony. It doesn't mean that everywhere you have oligopsony. You have competitive markets in a number of these places, and we've seen them on the ground where certain markets have a lot of intermediaries and they're all competing with each other. But you have a tendency where you have many sellers and only a few buyers, and amongst in this area you'll have very few big buyers. You may have 3 or 4 traders per village, but really the big buyers in an area will be a handful. And that means they have a lot of market power to set price and to set the terms of exchange. And therefore, in these markets, you need public regulation because their structure is one that has a tendency towards oligopsony, right? Also, you have to remember that these are physical markets. We've just been seeing a whole range of sites, and I'll just take you quickly through the pictures again. But what are we seeing? We are seeing physical markets. And when you have physical markets of this kind, you have a whole range of price and non-price things that a market has to do. So, for example, you have quality assaying that happens, you have weighment that happens, you have settlement that happens, and at each of these places, there is a possibility of conflict, right? There's a possibility where a farmer might be exploited, or a farmer may have, messed up, put good crop at the bottom and layered the bottom with poor grain. And so there will be conflict. So a very important part of a regulated market is to provide standardization of weights and measures, a good auctioning system and price information, and provide a dispute resolution system to ensure that settlement happens. The second thing that they have to do is actually provide counterparty risk. So you have many situations where traders run away without completing their payment, and lots of fly-by-night operators, which is why people, generally trade with people they know. Now, in this kind of thing, a mandi usually takes an advance. It usually takes advanced tax collection, or it has a certain system where it takes a deposit. And that's very important. So when you have electronic exchanges, stock markets, everything, there is a mechanism for settlement. And you have to have a mechanism for risk, for counterparty risk. So these were the original functions of APMC mandis. Now, the problem is we never really invested in them, right? And so the first thing to remember is that even if you open up the mandi system, even if you have multiple sites, you still need to ensure that you have well-regulated markets and that these price and non-price dimensions of market trade and practice are actually covered. And the problem with the farm laws is that they didn't pay any attention to all of this. There was no recording of price information. There was no attempt to actually put in place, proper auctioning systems. There was no attempt to look at counterparty risk. The dispute resolution system was faulty. So all of this needs to be addressed. Secondly, institutional design matters. We've had different kinds of evolution of APMCs in different states. Some are more farmer-centric, some are more trader-heavy. There are lots of dynamics which include agroecology, the political economy, the trade dynamics, the power of trader associations, technological change, and all of this has to be balanced by regulatory design. And what we've seen, and Madhya Pradesh was a great example, where the same mandi in the 1970s and 80s was completely against farmers, but reformed remarkably by 2000. When farmers became stronger as a result of the arrival of canal irrigation, much greater political representation, they started using the mandi as a site of activism. And a lot of reform came when, a farmer leader became the head of the mandi samiti, insisted on a electronic weighbridge being put in. Traders could not resist this. And so you saw in the same place, you saw mandi functionaries who had been in the pockets of traders and openly supporting them actually start organizing and reorganizing themselves and following the rules. You also see that in these multiple sites and channels versus deregulation. So, a big misconception that has happened is that we think that you need to deregulate everything. What you need is good regulation across multiple sites. And so you need to have a more comprehensive vision for regulation rather than deregulation. Because again, in asymmetric markets, where you have a tendency to oligopsonies, if you deregulation is usually re-regulation in favor of the powerful. which means in these cases in favor of capital. And that is exactly what you don't want to happen when you are trying to support farmers. Right? So the first common interest is in actually asking ourselves, what is the nature of these markets, and why do we need a good mix of, physical sites and public regulation while we need much more openness and competition. The second point is that we have to understand the limits of regulation. So the famous case that everybody always gives is Bihar, where Bihar actually abolished its APMC mandis and said that farmers will do brilliantly and all private capital will come and transform the state. And what we've seen, now nearly 16 years later, is that hasn't happened, right? Farmers in Bihar sold in villages to village intermediaries before the APMC Act when it was there. They continued to sell to village intermediaries after the APMC Act was abolished. In Ara and in many of the other districts where we did work, farmers didn't even know there had been an APMC Act or that the mandi functioned and that the mandi was defunct. And why was that? It was because the mandi was never set up for small farmers to engage in. It was set up for trader-to-trader exchange. And farmers always sold in the village, even though they were not in interlocked transactions in the village, right? So you can't simply assume this was a regulatory problem. It is actually a structural problem. And this is some of the most important learning that we have actually, had. That market power and competition is a problem in both regulated and unregulated markets. That the terms of engagement, particularly of farmers in markets, are responsive to the changing conditions of production and consumption. So for farmers, if your terms of production are not great, and the terms of consumption are not great in terms of demand, it's very difficult for you to locate yourself and to actually strengthen your case, right? Your terms of engagement for farmers are also based on how much land you have, whether you have access to credit, whether you have to have a distress sale and go in quickly to the market and take whatever you can, how far you are from the market, the main market site. So all of this. What we have understood is in the absence of understanding markets, disintermediation is often a misguided goal. We think that these intermediaries are making a huge amount of money, but what we have found is most of these markets are high volume, low margin markets, where intermediaries play multiple real functions and are usually quite efficient. We did some calculations and we actually find that they make marginally more than farmers. They're not particularly, especially the small intermediaries. It's the millers and processors and large wholesalers who have a lot more market power. These intermediaries actually play a risk role and they carry a lot of risk in these markets. Most large traders and big corporates will tell you that our markets are not inefficient. They are hyper efficient. They solve local problems very quickly, and they are very well adapted to structures of consumption and production. By that I mean very large number of very small farmers and very large number of very poor consumers. And intermediaries both on the retail side and on the wholesale and production and procurement side are adapted to these conditions. So they're good at finding markets and connecting these markets. They bear a lot of risk. There is exploitation wherever that's possible, but it's overblown when we think that there are huge margins everywhere. And this is one reason corporatization simply hasn't happened at the pace that people expected it to happen. I think it's also really important to remember that private trade will not come in and put infrastructure and institutions in places where there are not large margins. So one of the most revealing interviews I had was with a large corporate, multinational company who said that the problem in India is not that there are too many barriers to regulation, but that there are too few. What did they mean? They meant that, and this is, Rajat Kantaray's work has shown this, for the better part of the century, American multinationals have been troubled by the Indian bazaar. The problem is they are not able to get channel control. And so they said that if we cannot get channel command and channel control from seed to plate, we will remain asset light. Large corporations come in where they can actually, in a high volume, low margin business, control all segments together, including finance and credit and also input, seed, output, and processed products. right? Now, if they don't have that kind of channel command, they will not put public investment. So for India, actually, private investment. So for India, public investment is actually critical if we want to support regional capital and not have large-scale commercial systems take over the entire process, right? So this again is very important. What is our imagination of the private system? And then finally, market diversity does not necessarily mean fragmentation, because actually these markets are remarkably interconnected, and you will see traders and farmers show up everywhere. So when they say access to markets, actually if the market accesses you, you are part of the market. The question is, what are your terms of engagement? And here we found that location does really matter, and remoteness is a problem for those farmers who are far away from sites of consumption or even from a main mandi or a dense market. Enam, I already talked about this a little bit, is an app without a platform. It's not built on a robust physical platform, which it is supporting through really public goods, through better infrastructure, through better connectivity. Unless you do all that and build a real platform with a solid backend, Enam remains an app which is not plugged into a system. And we really don't see much intermandi or interstate trade at all happening here. Integration, we must remember, creates winners and losers. It promotes specialization and it transmits volatility, including from international markets. So, more integrated markets may be more efficient, but they will actually promote specialization rather than diversification. And it's really important that some farmers will lose. And so unless you have good risk mitigation systems, integration can actually, also harm some farmers while benefiting others. And this is where actually you need much more interstate cooperation, center-state cooperation to understand how different farmers are doing and how we need to sort out the compensation. Diversification is not straightforward. As I was saying, actually, as markets get more efficient, you actually get more specialization. Mid-sized farmers are more monocropped. We have a real challenge with scale and diversification, and we need to remember that in Indian markets, in Indian agriculture, the smallest actors are hyper-diversified, and they are diversified by distress, not by surplus. And very large actors in a regional economy or in a national economy tend to be very diversified. So we are seeing this with our large multinationals, our Indian large corporate conglomerates. They are highly diversified. And then very small actors are diversified. But one is diversification from distress, the other is diversification from concentration. How do we work out a productive diversification of the middle, right? Where there is surplus, where there is a degree of agroecological diversification, where there is a good balance between farm and non-farm diversification, and yet you see surplus and scale and more redistribution. Very tough to do. Everybody likes to talk about diversification. Its dynamics are the toughest things, and we aren't spending enough time talking about this, which is why what we need are more comprehensive frameworks and much more contextual and coordinated decision making on all of these. We need transition pathways for different regions, for different commodity systems. Some are highly commercialized, others are finding their way between food, subsistence, and commercialization. Others are shifting and pivoting towards export orientation. There is this constant tension between food and cash crops. So these are major things, and there's a constant tension between farm and non-farm. And again, of course, poultry and, allied. And so all of this needs us to think in a much more comprehensive and coordinated way. And that means we have to pay attention to institutions. Institutions of center-state cooperation, interstate and intrastate. Our state institutions for agriculture and our state capacity for agriculture needs a lot more investment. We need more public investment. Our extension systems have been hollowed out. We need more infrastructural investment. And when we do this, what you'll actually see is positive multipliers. So agriculture should be driving growth, and it should be driving, diversification. What we need are the dynamics of surplus sustained diversification. And that requires us to really invest in regions. It invests in state institutions, take agriculture as a state subject seriously, and this is where, like for institutions like CDS are so important because one has historically paid attention to states and regions. And we need to get all of these dynamics right. So decentralization needs more coordination. It needs more investment, not less, and it requires more capacity, not less. So I think these are the lessons we need to learn. We don't need to be depressed by the diversity. There's huge dynamism and huge opportunity. But what we need to understand is that if we want to change this, we need to have a vision for agriculture that connects all of this. And food and agricultural commodities are the most lively social, political, economic forces for us to have this imagination. They are economic as well, and I think it is about time that agriculture stops being seen as a welfare sector or some stalled structural transformation, and we see it in the right mode as the structural transformation. Agriculture, delivered more jobs even prior to COVID than manufacturing and services put together by a huge proportion. But these are not productive jobs, right? So agriculture remains India's greatest and most capacious sponge, but that sponge is not translating into incomes and livelihoods for the people who are involved in it. So that requires a whole different way of thinking about public investment, where to direct it, agricultural institutions, and how to think about policy and markets. So I'll stop here and I think we have 10 minutes for some more discussion as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mekhala. It was very fascinating. So much to learn. So much diversity, even within a state, across districts. So very interesting presentation. Now I would welcome questions. Anybody wants to ask any question? Let them ask. In the meantime, I have one. So in your field research, what did you see? Did you see the significance of contract farming, farmer producer organizations? You surveyed and studied so many markets across the country.
So it's very interesting. In Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, Odisha, Punjab, and Punjab of course has an old history of contract farming. You did not see the kind of large scale contract farming that you see. The scale is still very small, and I think even Sudha Narayanan's work in Tamil Nadu, you'll see it's very specific crops and very specific arrangements. So the scale is not large. Where you see contract farming really having a very large impact is in poultry. And the poultry sector is one where we really do need to study the contracting arrangements much more carefully. But in food grains, pulses, fruits and vegetables, what you see are really multiple sites of exchange. And the same farmer in the same lot will probably sell to 2 or 3 different kinds of entities, except where you have a very well established grain procurement system like in Punjab and Haryana, where everybody in the post harvest season, if they've grown wheat and paddy, which is what they mostly would have sold. But everywhere else, whether it's peas, whether it's potatoes, even in Punjab and Haryana, there will be multiple ways in which you will sell. And farmers are holding on, like we're seeing it this season as the prices are going higher. Farmers do hold. So, they do borrow from somewhere else if they have to, as they see prices going up. They are very price responsive. So everybody does have a very adaptive strategy to whatever information they are able to get. What you see is still a lot of intermediation where large buyers buy through intermediaries and through wholesalers. So, even the company I was talking to you about, we saw Cargill was buying right outside one of the villages, and farmers tried to sell to them, and they said, no, we don't buy from farmers, because the lot sizes are so small that to get the volumes that large companies want, they have to go through, basically they go through traders. FPOs, you do encounter them increasingly in many districts. The quality is very variable and largely not great. The problem you see here is that most FPOs are basically aggregators, and they go into the market trying to mimic traders, but they are producer companies. The thing is, traders can take risk for all kinds of reasons, and they have multiple ways of managing their risk. They don't make their money in a straightforward margin way. They also don't often make their money totally legally. So now you cannot compete very easily with them if your main proposition is I'll buy, I'll sell in a mandi, I'll stock, I'll store. Because there is risk, because there is volatility, you may do well in one season, but the same strategy won't serve you well the next season. Commercial logic is different. Having a much more conglomerate logic is different. So in the absence of good risk mitigation strategies or getting into the some amount of processing, many producer companies aren't able to do particularly well. One reason cooperatives, and this is Bhavaskar, Atwood's work, did so well in sugarcane and in milk, was because there was natural advantages to investing in that local area. For processors, right? Factories needed to put one amount of deep investment somewhere. These are highly perishable. So large and small farmers had good reasons to coordinate. But the same thing didn't work for cotton. The same thing didn't work for groundnut. They tried it for everything, right? So again, some crops highly commercialized with good contracts, or if a producer company has a tie-up with a good retailer who's finding deeper markets. So that kind of work where they say non-pesticide management, there's a particular quality or variety that they're selling, then you will see some changes. But that requires you to actually understand your product very well, understand the market very well, think quite entrepreneurially. A lot of FPOs end up spending whatever profit they've made on the managerial cost. You take a good Irman, a good person from CDS, one person, their salary, the CEOs, that itself will cover your margin that you've made. So you're not really then convincing the farmers that this makes a lot of sense. Governance is a big challenge. There are many people working on this, but I think a better approach in many of these places is not so much to think about FPOs as cooperatives or as necessarily as companies of that kind, but to think about them really as organizations. And their collective power of farmers in the market makes a big difference. It makes a big difference in terms of getting access to markets, putting pressure on the state to improve your mandis, to get better, facilities, to look for buyers. So I think collectivization can work in many different ways. I think again the assumption that you can just do away with the intermediary, the trader, the middleman, it's the same attitude. And then you go to the field and it's much more complex, right? Everything has a bearing cost. You take a warehouse, you have to have damage, you have to be able to take the credit for that. So unless you have the capacity to manage all of those additional infrastructural and commercial decisions, you won't do very well. So again, some are doing well. There are one high capacity, and those who are really engaging with the market. My concern has been that they don't understand the market well enough, and it's also because a lot of civil society organizations have taken on the FPO job. Just like the state often doesn't understand markets well enough, civil society organizations also don't pay enough attention to market dynamics. Right. There's an inherent suspicion of how some of these function. So, understanding that and understanding cropping dynamics and all of that is really important. Another very important thing to keep in mind, and this is where they can play a very important policy role, is the holding the state accountable for what it should be doing, right? Markets are also not particularly great, and this is why contract farming is also a challenge, where if you ruin your agricultural endowment, so your agroecology, by growing one thing for too long, markets won't correct. As soon as you stop being a good production center, they will relocate. The buyers will relocate, but you have to live with that soil. You have to live with that water for a long time. So again, thinking agroecologically, but with an understanding of both the commercial dynamics and the procurement dynamics, really working that out, I think is really, challenging. I think some states are beginning to do that. So I think having that vision for FPOs would probably be better than a narrow, aggregator vision of FPOs. Yeah.
Right. Anybody else? It's 3:29, so maybe one question if anybody has any questions.
I know it's a lot. One of the problems whenever I present this material is it's just a lot to process, and I think it's challenging for us to make sense of markets. There's a reason that we don't pay attention to them. Beyond the big statements. And so, I will send some material. Maybe others will find it easier to read and go through some of it.
But one very good thing that you did, at the beginning, so it was very important. Usually people don't do that. Primary, secondary, tertiary market, so like that spot market, future market. There's so many different jargons, many markets. What are they? Often that is not something that is taken seriously, and then
correct. And also just the difference between, when we say the market, a marketplace, a mandi, a market site, which is why I always say, access to a market is a very funny term. If John Robinson used to say, nothing worse than being out of, only thing worse than being in capitalism is being completely abandoned by it. Well, the same thing with markets. When we say access to markets, usually markets access farmers. And if you have sold your crop, whether you sold it to a money lender, whether you sold it internally, in your village to a larger farmer, if you sold it or exchanged it, it means the market has landed up and done some work with you. Now, the question is, what are your terms of engagement with markets? So the change that we have to do is not just about access to markets, because markets access you, but they usually access farmers, particularly small and marginal farmers, on very unfavorable terms to the farmers. Right. So the question is, how can you strengthen the terms of your engagement with markets? And for that, the role of the state is very critical. That it is also there to strengthen, to put farmers in a position where what weakens them systemically and structurally you can address, right? So production is very important for that. That's why credit is extremely important. Why getting warehouse receipts, if you could get it sorted. But if you come up with such a complex warehouse receipt system, no farmer can actually access it. You want to bring futures market to give farmers risk mitigation. But, the lot size to participate in a futures market is 10 tons. Most farmers cannot even sell. Most traders in India don't do hedging with 10 tons. So, you have to then change your lot size. You have to, and this is where actually FPOs and others and collectives can play a very important role. That is actually thinking from the perspective of farmers and scale. What are the benefits? But it is to behave like producers and not to start thinking that if we just behave like traders, we'll be fine. A lot of farmers in Harda, once they have the capacity to hold, would hold and stock. And they would do very well in 1 year and very badly in the next years. Most countries would give farmers risk mitigation measures, hedging abilities, so that kind of thing doesn't happen, right? But this is where innovation is not happening. We're not paying attention to these kinds of instruments. And there's a lot of work where if the state and different actors came together to actually try to crack these problems without thinking there's a tech fix or you can simply hedge or behave like traders, there's a different world that we could potentially access here. But I will send some readings. Hopefully people will find that, helpful, and, even if it just makes you a little more careful in how you think about markets and how they work, that would be.
I'm sure it will be very helpful. Thank you, Mekhala. Thank you so much for your time and for the very insightful lecture. And now then I will end this session. So don't go away, participants. So for the next session starts at 4 o'clock, right? So we'll join back at 4 o'clock. Thank you, Mekhala. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mekhala.